Chapter 8. Denise shook off her bruised feelings. Of course, she and John Donnelly weren't friends. They'd just met, after all, and he was here because he had a job to do. So what if they'd enjoyed a nice meal together the night before? That was no reason to let herself believe they could form a friendship. Apparently, he thought they were already too familiar. "This is the best pizza ever!" Ella shoved a huge bite into her mouth. Denise should probably tell her to take smaller bites. She should probably remind her to chew with her mouth closed. Eventually, she'd get around to doing those things with Ella, to being a parent, not just a vacation destination. But today was about fun. It was about reconnecting and forging a stronger bond. She'd leave the hard parts of parenting to Reed and Jackie for one more day. No wonder Reed despised her. "Don't you like it?" Ella eyed the untouched slice on Denise's plate. She lifted it, took a bite, swallowed, and said, It's really good." It was, too. The pizza place had been in town since Denise was in high school. It wasn't the fanciest place in the world, and it had evolved a little, offering unique flavor combinations that certainly hadn't been on the menu a decade before. But the crust and sauce were the same as they'd always been. This was the pizza she compared every pizza to, no matter where in the world she was. Ella said, "I can't wait to tell my friends you're here. You're coming to the play, right? Just tell me when and where, and I'll be there." "Oh." Her eyes, already bright, lit up. "And there's a class Christmas party, and we're all going to show off our wreaths. I invited Daddy and Jackie, but you can come too." Reed would love that. Hopefully he'd be civil in front of witnesses. "What kind of wreaths?" "We're supposed to decorate them, but I don't know what to put on mine. Daddy's not very good at crafts, and Jackie—" Ella lowered her voice as if her stepmom might hear. "She's even worse." Denise couldn't help the smile. "You know who is good at crafts?" She tapped her chest. "This girl right here. I used to kill it in art class." Ella's eyes lit up. "Really? Will you help me?" "I'd love to. Tell me what you're supposed to do." Between bites, Ella told her about the assignment to create a gratitude wreath. "We're supposed to cover it with stuff that shows what we're thankful for. But not like the actual stuff. Like, if I'm thankful for my new bike, I could put a picture of the bike." "It would be hard to attach a bicycle to a wreath," Denise said. "But so funny." Ella's smile morphed to a frown. "I bet if Clara could attach her horses, she would. She'd march them right into the classroom if Mrs. Brooks would let her." "You don't like horses?" Denise asked. "I love horses, but Clara's always bragging about hers. Her parents own like 100 of them or something. One of them is hers. His name is Chestnut." "Have you seen him?" "Just pictures. She brings pictures all the time. I bet her wreath will be all pictures of Chestnut. She thinks having a horse makes her the coolest kid in class, even though my mommy is a movie star." Ella's eyes brightened. "Oh my gosh! I could have all pictures of you in all your different movies. Maybe I could even get action figures, and pictures of us together, and other, movie stuff. Like popcorn and soda and movie tickets. And Beverly Hills stuff, like maybe palm trees. And if you're there and all my friends could meet you, that would be so cool." Denise was tempted to feel flattered by her daughter's words, but she guessed the sentiment behind them. The guess was solidified when Ella added, "Clara would be so jealous." Oh man. This was one of those hard parenting moments she preferred to leave to Reed. She tossed up a quick prayer for wisdom. "Is that the point of your gratitude wreath? To make the other kids jealous?" Ella's face fell. Denise loved how her daughter's feelings showed so clearly in her expression. She loved that Ella didn't feel the need to hide her true self behind a mask. Reed had given her that confidence. Reed had created this amazing child. Maybe, though, maybe some of Ella's kind, unique personality came from Denise's genes. Maybe she could take a little credit. "No?" Ella's little shoulders slumped. "What is the purpose again?" "I think it's to remember to be thankful. Jansen said that Thanksgiving is supposed to be the thankfulness holiday, and Christmas is supposed to be the presents holiday, but Mrs. Brooks said we should be even more thankful at Christmas, 'cause Jesus came to earth like a present just for us." "I love that. And she loved that her daughter went to a school where the teachers weren't afraid to talk about Jesus. What are you most thankful for? You, because you're here. Not because Denise was a movie star who gave Ella bragging rights, but because she'd come home. She didn't relish the idea of the wreath being about her. She didn't deserve that recognition. Good mothers stayed with their children. What else are you thankful for? Ella shrugged. I don't know. My house, I guess. But Mrs. Brooks said we should try to have where everything goes together. I forget the word. A theme? Yeah, a theme. Clara's will probably be horses. Don't worry about what Clara will do. Denise was tempted to buy Ella a horse so she could compete with the other child. But that was Hollywood Denise. Coventry Denise needed to learn to be a year-round mother, not a month-long mother. Not a mother who showed her love through gifts instead of time. Clara's wreath can be beautiful in Clara's style, Denise said. And if it's covered with horses, then good for Clara. But what are you most thankful for? Again, Ella shrugged. And Denise guessed it wasn't because she didn't have an answer, but because she didn't want to say it. I bet you're thankful for your daddy. Ella's head bobbed. Did she feel like she couldn't say so in front of Denise? I'm thankful for your daddy, too, Denise said. He's the very best daddy, isn't he? Again, Ella's head bobbed, and then her eyes popped wide. Oh my gosh, Daddy told me I could tell you and I forgot. Jackie's gonna have a baby. I'm gonna have a little brother. Isn't that the coolest thing? That is so cool, Denise said. You must be excited. Uh-huh. Me and Jackie have been working on his bedroom. Jackie and I, Denise said gently. Ella either didn't hear or pretended not to. We painted the walls blue and got a rug to go over the carpet with all space stuff on it, like planets and rocket ships, and there's stars on the ceiling that glow in the dark. I bet you're thankful for your brother already, aren't you? Uh-huh. And you know who else? Grammy and Gramps. They're in Florida, but they'll be back before Christmas. They take me to the movies every weekend when they're here. The mention of Denise's parents had her heart aching. She both anticipated and dreaded their return. Would they be happy she'd bought a house in town, or would they see it as too little, too late? The way Reed saw it. Ella added, and of course Mimi and Poppy. Reed's parents, who hated Denise almost as much as Reed did. That's a lot of people who love you. No wonder you're so thankful. Ella looked down, chewing her fingernail. She'd eaten about half her slice of pizza, but she didn't seem inclined to eat more. What about Jackie? Denise suggested. She's pretty awesome. She's smart and nice, and she takes good care of you. Ella looked back up, seeming almost nervous. She works a lot, but when she's not working, we play games and have fun, and she brushes my hair and puts it in braids sometimes. She's a good stepmom, isn't she? At Ella's nod, Denise asked, and her parents? Are you thankful for them? Grandmother and Granddaddy. I don't see them very much, but they always buy me presents. They're nice to me. She met Denise's eyes, then looked away. You're not mad? About what? That I love Jackie and Grandmother and Granddaddy? Because Jansen's mommy and stepmommy hate each other, and he says he's only allowed to like one of them at a time. Wow. No wonder the kid had issues. Still, if he ever bullied Ella, Denise would send John Donley to have a talk with him. That ought to straighten him out. She turned her chair to face her daughter. Beautiful girl, I'm thankful, just like you are, that you have an amazing family. You have a daddy and a stepmother who love you, 6 grandparents who adore you, and you're about to have a baby brother who'll probably idolize you. And you'll always have me. Ella's little feet were swinging below the table as she smiled. And now you live here. I have the best family in the whole wide world. Do you think I can make it about that? I can't think of a better theme for your gratitude wreath. Denise hadn't been to the Christmas store in North Conway since she was Ella's age, but she'd never forgotten it. Now, as she and Ella walked toward the front doors, anticipation had her heart fluttering. She couldn't wait to share this with her daughter. She could practically feel John, Donley. Would she ever get accustomed to calling him that? Scowling beside her. He hadn't been happy about their spontaneous plan to go shopping, but he'd managed it nevertheless. 4 bodyguards, including John and Lake, accompanied Denise and Ella. Another 4 would place themselves around the property at strategic locations. Where those locations were, Denise couldn't venture to guess. On their way to the front door, they passed glittering Christmas trees, blow-up yard decorations, and a few motorized reindeer. Ella stopped about 2 feet inside, eyes wide. Christmas decor took up every inch of merchandising space. Jingle bells played on the speakers overhead. The scent of pine was overpowered by chocolate and cinnamon from the station nearby, where teens dressed as elves offered hot chocolate and apple cider. Santa Claus sat in an oversized armchair, a kid on each knee and a third standing beside. They were all posing for a photograph. "Mommy, it's beautiful!" Ella's tone was reverent, as if she'd just stepped onto holy ground. "Do you want to sit on Santa's lap?" Ella looked from the man in the red suit back to her mom. "Is it okay? There's a long line." "Let's do it." The line took almost an hour, and Denise enjoyed every minute of it, asking Ella what she wanted for Christmas, finding out special presents she'd been given in years past, learning her favorite traditions. She'd only spent one Christmas with her daughter, the previous one, but she intended to never miss another. Reed would have to learn to share. After Ella had her picture made with Santa, she asked, "Can we get hot chocolate?" "How about we shop first and then do that after?" Ella agreed and started wandering from display to display, touching ornaments and pointing at decorations she loved. Denise was tempted, so tempted, to tell Ella to pick out anything she wanted. Denise could afford to buy every item in the place, but that wasn't a good lesson to teach her daughter. Instead, she said, "Why don't you get out your list?" Ella dug into her pocket, pulled out the paper they'd written their notes on, and looked for ornaments to represent each of the people she was thankful for. This place boasted 10,000 ornaments. Surely they'd be able to choose something for everybody. Ella found an ornament shaped like a lab coat to represent Jackie, a research scientist. A man in scrubs represented Jackie's physician father. Ella picked a needle and thread ornament for Denise's mother, who loved cross-stitch, and golf clubs for her dad. An airplane would work for Reed's father, who'd repaired airplanes for years, and an ornament depicting flowers represented Reed's mother, a gardener. Ella was stuck on Jackie's mother, who didn't have a job outside the home. "Does she play golf or tennis?" Denise asked. Based on what Ella had said about her step-grandparents, Denise assumed they were wealthy. It seemed as good a guess as any. Ella arugó su cara. "I don't know." She was distracted by a miniature Christmas village with all sorts of motorized displays. Reindeer lifted their heads and looked around. A Santa figurine waved at children. A carousel rotated. "When you go to see them," Denise asked, "does she take you to do anything?" Still staring through the glass at the display, Ella shook her head. "She's always busy cooking." "Do you ever help?" Ella looked at Denise and nodded. "Uh-huh. We made cookies last time I was there, and I helped with the lasagna. I got to lay out the noodles and spread the icky white cheese stuff." Denise wasn't a fan of ricotta either. "Maybe you could find her something that represents how you cook together." "That's a good idea. I think she'll like that." Ella scurried to another ornament display and found one depicting a red apron with cooking utensils in the pockets. A blue cradle represented the baby. Denise picked out a world's greatest father ornament for Reed, and Ella beamed. "That's perfect." Of course it was. "That just leaves you," Ella said. She wandered from tree to tree, looking at and then rejecting ornament after ornament. She found a palm tree, like where you live, and then left it there. "'Cause you don't live there anymore, right?" "But I will have to go back sometimes." Which was true, but only for short periods of time, and only if they weren't filming on location, and all that only assuming the studio renewed her contract. She didn't actually have to live in LA, but to sell the house there, to plan to relocate here indefinitely. She wasn't ready yet. Maybe this would go well, maybe not. Maybe, once Ella got to know her better, she'd decide she didn't like her mother any more than everyone else who used to love her. Maybe Ella wouldn't want her around forever, no matter what she said now. Denise would keep the Beverly Hills house for the time being. She needed to have a place she could call home if this didn't work out. Ella found a tree with superhero characters and searched until she located an Ember Flare action figure. She studied that ornament a long time. You like that one? It doesn't. It's not exactly right. Denise was glad when Ella left the action figure hanging on the tree. That wasn't who Denise was, even if it was how most of the world saw her. She was about as close to a superhero as a little boy with a 10-gallon hat was to a real cowboy. She also didn't deserve a world's greatest mother ornament, even if she wished she did. Reed had earned his title. No matter how good a mom Denise learned to be, she'd never compete with him. But it wasn't a competition. She just had to be the best mother she could be going forward, which meant not giving in to the regret that bombarded her daily. Fingers skimming the ornaments, Ella moved to another display, a mishmash of things. Ella studied each until she finally reached out and took one. A vintage movie camera. What about this? I think it's perfect, Denise said. It represents me like the lab coat represents Jackie, right? It's what I do, even if it wasn't who she was. Ella didn't seem as pleased with the selection as she had the others. If you don't like that, we can find something else, Denise suggested. But what? The problem was, Ella didn't know her mother the way she should. Denise could think of 50 images to describe her own parents, but she'd spent her childhood with them. She knew them, knew what mattered to them. Ella simply didn't know Denise. The thought brought familiar shame. She scanned the room until her gaze landed on something on the far side. She took Ella's hand and walked across the space, dodging other customers and ignoring the bodyguards who hadn't strayed more than a few feet away. She crouched in front of the tree. Hanging there was a simple red heart-shaped ornament. Denise lifted it and turned to her daughter. This represents me. No matter how far away I've been, no matter how distant a mommy I've been, you have never, ever left my heart. I have loved you every single second of your life. Ella's gaze flicked from her mom to the heart and back. Really? Yes, really. Denise wanted to hold her daughter, to assure her of her love. But now wasn't the time. She didn't have to cram it all into one visit. Denise replaced the heart on the tree carefully. But I think, for your wreath, the movie camera works. It matches the theme, right? Almost all of your ornaments are about what the people in your family do, either for jobs or for hobbies. Ella looked into the little basket Denise had set beside them. She lifted her dad's ornament. This doesn't represent what Daddy does. I think it does. You have been your daddy's #1 priority since the moment he laid eyes on you. It does represent how Daddy spends his time. Ella fingered the little glass heart again. I like this better than the camera. Denise almost choked up at the thought, but she kept the emotion at bay. You know what? I do too. Satisfied, Ella dug out the vintage camera, hung it on the tree, and set the heart-shaped ornament in the basket. Did we get everybody? Denise asked. Ella studied her list carefully, then looked up, beaming. Can we start working on it today? Denise glanced at her watch. It was nearly 5 o'clock, and they had an hour's drive back to Coventry. Daddy wanted you home for dinner. Could you ask him if I can stay with you tonight? You can take me to school tomorrow. As much as Denise would love that, she already knew how Reed would react. She didn't think it was a good idea to push it tonight. One step at a time. How about this? She said. How about I ask if you can sleep over another night this week? I think your daddy wants you home tonight. Ella's face fell, but she didn't argue as they made their way to the checkout counter. The line was long. Though Reed hadn't given her a specific time to have Ella home, she guessed he expected her by 6. She'd call from the car and let him know what time they'd get there. Don't forget, you promised we could have hot chocolate. Of course! She had forgotten, which meant she'd get Ella home more than a little late. But 6:30 would still leave plenty of time to eat, and if Reed and Jackie didn't want to wait, Denise would happily feed her before she dropped her off. It should be fine. They were next in line when she heard a familiar voice with a familiar tone. There you are! Denise took a deep breath and turned as Reed stomped toward her. Others looked too, not just at Reed, but at Denise. Because of the low lights in the store and her nondescript clothing, nobody had paid her any attention. But now she saw sparks of recognition in faces around her. People turned to gawk. John shifted beside her as if Reed were an axe murderer, not an irritated ex. She braced herself and plastered a smile on her face. When he got close enough to speak to her with a low voice, she said, "I was just about to call you." "Sure you were." Reed held out his hand toward Ella. "Come on, sweetheart, we're going to be late." Ella scooted behind Denise. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with Mommy." Reed's face, already red with anger, contorted as he glared at Denise. "I told you we had dinner plans." "What?" No, he hadn't. She didn't want to have this conversation, and she certainly didn't want to have it in front of a store full of witnesses. She stepped out of line, handed her basket to a clerk behind the counter, and said, "I'll be right back for that." Holding Ella's hand, she stalked past Reed and out the door, then around a giant Christmas tree with multicolored twinkle lights to a relatively private spot. It was chilly outside, but her anger kept her warm. Reed followed on her heels, along with 6 bodyguards. "It's 5 o'clock, Reed. You didn't give me a specific time, so I figured 6 or 6:30. There's no way you'd have had her home in time. Thank God I checked in with Lake." Denise wanted to scowl at the bodyguard. It might not have been Lake's job to keep Ella's whereabouts from her father, but she could have at least warned Denise that he'd called. "In time for what?" "I told you we had plans. Jackie's business is having a Christmas party tonight for the staff. I'm supposed to be in Plymouth at 6. As it is, I had to send Jackie to set up by herself." "You didn't tell—" "How dare you take her out of Coventry without my permission?" "I don't need your permission, Reed. I'm her mother." "You have no rights here." "I don't think a judge would see it that way." He glared at her. Then to Ella, he said, "Let's go, sweetheart." Ella gripped Denise's hand harder. "I don't want to go to the stupid party." Reed shot Denise a scathing look before crouching down in front of their daughter. "Santa's going to be there, remember?" "I sat on Santa's lap already." If Reed had looked angry before, now he seemed ready to explode as he stood and faced Denise. "You took her to see Santa?" "He was here." She winked at Ella, hiding the embarrassment and fury simmering beneath the surface. "He had to leave, though. Now we know he must have been headed to Jackie's party, right?" "Probably." Ella didn't smile as her gaze flicked between her parents. Couldn't Reed see what their arguing was doing to her? "How about this?" Denise leaned down to Ella. "Why don't you go to the party with your dad, and you and I can get together tomorrow to start the wreath?" "She has dance tomorrow," Reed said. Denise kept the smile on her face, though it felt as fragile as dried clay. She squeezed Ella's hand. "After dance?" "Dinner and bath and bed," Reed said. Denise looked up at him. "What day works for you, Reed?" Because this obviously wasn't about Ella, but about him. "I'll have to get back to you." He reached for Ella's hand. "Let's go." "No!" She burst into tears and clung to Denise. Denise's eyes prickled with emotion. So much for the world's greatest daddy. She took Ella in her arms and whispered in her ear, "I'm not going anywhere, beautiful girl. I'll be right in my house. Your daddy and I will figure out a time for you to come over. I promise." "I want to stay with you." Never, in all the times Ella had gone to California to see her, had she expressed a desire to stay longer. She'd always looked forward to returning to her father. That she wanted Denise brought such a rush of joy, she could hardly contain it. She squelched it and forced herself to be sensible. "I want that too, but your daddy wants you to go to the party with him and Jackie tonight. I bet it'll be fun." Ella's arms just tightened around Denise's neck. She could smack Reed for doing this. To him, she said, "How about I take her to dance tomorrow?" He seemed to search for some reason that was a bad idea, but came up short. "Fine." She backed up and met Ella's tear-filled eyes. "I'll stay and watch you dance, okay?" Ella sniffed and nodded. "Can I come over after?" "Your dad and I will discuss it. I had so much fun with you today. I'll go inside and buy all that stuff, and it'll be ready for us the next time you come over. Will you buy everything else we need? They discussed a shopping list, wreath, ribbons, and other decorations. Finally, Denise set her daughter down to let her go with Reed. But he wasn't there. She spied him a few feet away in a quiet conversation with John. Neither man looked happy.
Chapter 9. If Reed Coate didn't watch himself, he'd get more than a stern lecture. John squared off with the man a few yards from where Denise and Ella were talking. "We have a problem." Coate rubbed his arm where John had grabbed him, the same spot he'd gripped the night before. "We're going to have a problem if you ever grab me again." John ignored that. "Our job as bodyguards is to protect. One way we do that is by staying close without drawing attention to ourselves or our clients. Ms. Masters and your daughter managed to spend hours here surrounded by bodyguards without anybody giving them a second glance. As far as I know, not a single person recognized your ex-wife, and then you barreled in and drew attention to yourself and to her. Suddenly, people lifted their phones. They took videos. Do you think that made her more safe or less safe? That's not my problem. Maybe you don't care about your child's mother." Coate flinched at the implication, because of course the man should. "But Ella's safety is your problem, and a whole bunch of people just got photos and videos of her with a famous actress, a woman whose life might be in danger." Realization dawned slowly, and color leached from Coate's face. He ran a hand from forehead to chin. "I didn't. That never occurred to me." "Maybe you should try to think past your anger for 2 seconds before your next encounter with Ms. Masters." John took a step closer. "In fact, you should more than try. You pull another stunt like that, you'll have more than a bruise on your arm to show for it." "Are you threatening me?" He gave the man a long look. "I'm warning you to stop being an idiot." He stepped back, almost far enough that Coate could pass him, and returned to retrieve his daughter. "But not quite. And for the record, you didn't tell Ms. Masters about your plans tonight. You said to have Ella home by dinner time because it was a school night. You owe her an apology." He wasn't sure why he'd said that. As Ms. Masters' bodyguard, it was his job to keep her safe. It wasn't his job to get involved in interpersonal conflicts. But the way this jerk had barreled in and started hurling insults had John itching to defend her. Coate shouldered past and returned to where Ms. Masters and Ella stood waiting for him. John stayed close enough that Coate had to know he was there, which was the point. He was lucky John hadn't throttled him. Coate stopped a few feet from his ex-wife. "You're, His voice was calm, at least. "Donnelly told me I didn't tell you about tonight's dinner. I thought I had. I'm sorry for yelling at you. That was uncalled for." Ms. Masters' eyes widened. "Oh, that's—" John braced himself, waiting for her to tell the rude man it was all right that he treated her that way when it was absolutely not all right. But she surprised him. "I appreciate the apology, and I forgive you." John wished he could see Coate's face. Ms. Masters continued. "I'll pick up Ella from school tomorrow and take her to dance. Will you text me the details, please?" "Fine." He held out his hand. "Tell your mom goodbye." Ella did, and then went with her father. Miss Masters watched until they and their bodyguards disappeared into the parking lot, then spun and returned to the store. John stayed by her side as she waited in line to pay for her things. He doubted she'd noticed what any of them cost, but the tally was north of $200, all for a basket full of ornaments, many of which would honor Coate and his family. John had heard the things Miss Masters had said about Ella's stepmother, his parents and hers, even Ella's father, about what a good man he was. Maybe he was. By Miss Masters' admission, she hadn't been a good mother. She hadn't been available for Ella. She hadn't made Ella a priority. Maybe that was true. Ella certainly hadn't argued. But watching Miss Masters and Ella today, and then watching the two parents interact just now, John would pick Ms. Masters' brand of parenting over Coate's any day of the week.
Chapter 10. Reed had apologized. Actually apologized. Settling into bed for the evening, Denise was still amazed. She'd imagined the day ending with her walking Ella to Reed's door, saying hello to Jackie, and congratulating her on the baby, getting a glimpse of the house Reed and Jackie had bought together. She'd imagined a goodbye hug on the doorstep, her daughter going inside, but glancing back for one final look at her mother. It was possible Denise had spent a little too much time imagining the perfect day with her daughter. And no, it hadn't ended like she'd hoped it would. But other than that, it had been perfect. She had no doubt that the heated conversation between John and her ex had led to Reed's apology. Even so, he'd done it. Maybe there was hope. Maybe Reed and Denise could forge a new relationship, one built on mutual respect, mutual love for their daughter. Maybe Denise could really build a life here. She opened her devotional and read that day's message, which reminded her of her freedom in Christ. She was free now. She might not always feel free, but feelings weren't a gauge for the truth. She'd made so many mistakes, endured so much hurt, not all of it self-induced, but she'd arrived on the other side of those trials a better person, a stronger person. She could be Ella's mother, even be a positive force in her life. She could do this. She would do this. Meditating on the verse in her devotional, she shut off her light and snuggled beneath the covers in the chilly room. She had been set free from sin. All her life she'd been a slave, of attention, of fame, eventually of substances. But now she was a servant of God. And the benefit God promised was holiness. Holiness and eternal life. That the perfect Creator God could have chosen her out of the world and made her clean. That He promised her holiness and forever with Him. It was astonishing. Like she did most nights, she fell asleep with scripture on her mind. Shattering glass yanked her awake. Before she could process what had happened, a man filled her doorway. He crouched low and crossed to her bed. Terror built in her chest and escaped on a scream, which exploded into the silence. "It's me!" John yanked the comforter off her bed and laid it on the floor. "Come on, stay low." It was John, the bodyguard. Not. She shook her head, but the face she'd imagined wouldn't shake off. "What happened?" "Ms. Masters, come on." When she didn't move, he said, "Come with me now, Denise." His use of her name snapped her out of her fog. Cold air wrapped around her, raising goosebumps on her skin. The light coming through the doorway illuminated a broken window. On the other side of the room, something protruded from her wall. What was that? He tugged her hand. "Come on, and stay down." She slithered off the bed onto the floor, realizing then why he'd tossed her blanket down. Beyond it, shards of glass glittered across the carpet in the low light. As soon as she started crawling, John shifted behind her, almost over her. But the closeness of his body didn't bring the terror it should have. He wasn't threatening. He was protecting. Outside the window, shouts rose in the darkness. "That way! Stay low! No, no, protect the front!" All she could think was Ella. Thank God Ella wasn't here. In the distance, an engine roared to life, and then the sound faded. She reached the end of the comforter and started to stand, but John pressed a hand to her back. A few more feet, all the way into the hallway and out of sight of the windows. Watch out for glass. She kept moving until the pressure of John's hand let up. She cautiously stood, turning to peer back into the bedroom. John stopped her from looking and gently urged her against the wall. "Stay here." He continued down the hallway, closing the doors to the other bedrooms, then returned to her. He gripped her arm gently. "Come on." She allowed him to support her as she descended the steps. Her window had shattered. She pictured the thing she'd seen protruding from her wall. Someone had shot an arrow through her window? There had been 3 bodyguards on duty, and more asleep in the apartment on the property. But someone had gotten close enough to fire an arrow through her window. Close enough that it shattered the glass and embedded in her wall. She aimed for the couch, feeling dizzy and confused, but John urged her to the door leading to the basement. "Where are we going?" "Just until we know it's safe." He ushered her down the creepy staircase. She'd only been in the basement twice, once when she first moved in and again to show the room to Ella. She didn't relish the idea of returning. But John wasn't asking her opinion as he led her across the freezing concrete floor and through the hidden doorway at the back. He entered the safe room with her, flipped on the overhead light, closed the door, and locked it. "We're in," John said, obviously not to her. They stood in the center of the empty space, him in a sweatshirt, jeans, socks, shoes, her in a fitted pink tank top and skimpy short shorts, shivering. The floor and walls were concrete. The door was steel or something equally cold and uninviting. "There's a bed through there," John said, nodding toward another door. A bed? She hadn't seen that, and its presence didn't make her feel better. It just doubled down on the creep factor. Her stomach was churning. She feared she might be sick if she moved. And anyway, she didn't want to go farther into this terrifying space alone. She'd just stand there and freeze. He spoke again to his teammates, his voice low and no nonsense. "Every inch of the property. I understand that, but—" A long pause. "Get Randall on those cameras. Now." He glanced her way, then paused for a better look. "You okay?" No?" He moved into the other room and came back with a blanket, which he draped around her shoulders. She gripped the edges and pulled it closed at the neck. The warmth helped. He stayed behind her, close, holding the blanket in place. His hands, so sure and strong on her shoulders, calmed her just a little. "They've searched the entire property." His voice rumbled in her ear and sent fresh shivers across her skin. Only she didn't think those came from a chill, but from something else entirely. "As soon as they clear the house, we'll go upstairs." "Okay." He backed away, and she missed the heat of his body, the comfort of his closeness. He stepped around her and leaned back against the door. "Next time I tell you to come, you come." Was he annoyed with her? "I was half asleep, disoriented." "All the more reason to do what you're told." She wasn't about to apologize for not obeying his orders 1 second after she woke up, but she got his point. "I'll do my best." Footsteps pounded overhead. A moment later, John must have gotten the all clear because he said, "We're coming up." He followed her out of the basement and settled her on the couch, where she snuggled beneath her blanket. The lights had almost all been off when they'd hurried through before, but somebody had turned them on. The room was bright, the front door wide open, probably the back door too. She was so cold. "Stay there, okay?" She nodded, and he went to the kitchen, leaving her alone. Well, not alone. A guard stood at the front door, another stood at the back. Nobody was getting past those guys. John spoke to the one behind her. "Anything?" The man answered in a low tone that Denise couldn't hear. The clock on her wall told her it was nearly 1 a.m. From her vantage point, she could see that the light was on down the hall in the office. Had John still been working? When she'd tired of seeing police reports and gruesome photos spread out on her kitchen table, she'd encouraged him to set up back there. When did he sleep? Not that she was sorry he had been here. It was bad enough having been awakened in such a terrifying way. She couldn't imagine if it had been a stranger standing over her. Sure, she'd met everybody on duty, but would she recognize them in the dark after being so shockingly torn from sleep? Embers in the fireplace glowed. If she weren't so cold, she'd get up and stoke them, add another log. John returned and crouched in front of her. "Are you all right?" She was, thank God. Scared, but alive. But if Ella had been there, the shattering glass, the shouts, the activity, she would have been terrified. John was waiting for an answer. "I'm okay." He looked her over, but most of her was hidden beneath the blanket. "No cuts?" She checked her hands, then peeked under the blanket at her knees. A normal person would wear long pajama pants in the winter in New Hampshire, but she'd always hated sleeping in much more than a t-shirt and shorts. She relied on her down comforter to keep her warm. Seeing no blood on her legs, she said, "Quick thinking with the blanket to cover the glass." "It's not foolproof, you sure?" "I'm fine, John." His eyes narrowed the slightest bit, but he didn't chastise her for the use of his name. Instead, he stood and stoked the fire. "Let me get this going. And maybe something else to wear? Something more, I'd appreciate that. Do you have clothes anywhere but in your bedroom? I'm sure the police won't want us disturbing that room until after they've had a look at it." "Weirdly, I keep all my clothes in my closet." He glanced back at her, and maybe the tiniest smile graced his lips. You are an odd duck. He peeled his sweatshirt off, leaving him in a t-shirt that hugged his muscles just right. He held it toward her. Until we can get you something else. But you'll be cold. I'm fine, ma'am. She'd started to take it, but dropped her hand. I can't wear the sweatshirt of a man who calls me ma'am. He blew out a long breath. Please take it, Denise. Heavy emphasis on her name. The police will be here any second, and I'm sure you'd like to wear something more than that. That. He waved toward her, though her tank top was hidden beneath the blanket. She took the sweatshirt and slid it on. It was still warm and smelled like him, like pine and a wood fire. She let the blanket fall to her lap and pulled the sweatshirt over her hips. If she stood, she figured it would reach almost to her knees, certainly beyond her flimsy shorts. Still not as much coverage as she'd like, but better than before. He put a log on the embers, and they sparked to life. What happened? She asked. Somebody shot an arrow through your window. Worked out that much myself. Did they catch him? The scowl on his face told her the answer before he uttered a low, Guy escaped on a four-wheeler? How? There are four-wheeler trails. He gestured with his chin toward the backyard. But the closest one passes quite a distance from your house, and the way between is overgrown and thick with brush. We installed a camera on the trail where it passes. I don't know yet if he came from a different direction, or if we just missed it on the video feed. We should have seen him coming. He never should have gotten so close. John looked furious. The police are watching the trail's different access points, but I'm guessing this guy had a way out of the woods. He didn't hurt me, she said. You did everything you could. Did I? He turned away, obviously not expecting an answer. Before she could remind him that she was safe, that nobody had gotten hurt, John tapped the contraption at his waist, said, Okay, and stalked toward the front door. He swung it open. Detective Pollard stepped inside, a uniformed officer right behind him. The detective crossed to Denise on the couch and crouched in front of her. You all right? She nodded. They took care of me. Good, good. He stood and turned to John. Show me. Her bodyguard led the detective and the uniformed officer up the stairs. She knew John expected her to stay where she was, but this was her house. That was her bedroom. She scrambled to her feet, yanked the sweatshirt down, and hurried up behind them. The higher she climbed, the colder it got. She'd need to cover that window with something until she could have it repaired. She watched her step, careful of her bare feet with the glass, and stood at the threshold of her bedroom. Inside, John and the detective studied the arrow that had lodged in the wall opposite her bed. Angle's not steep enough, John said. Detective Pollard glanced at the arrow, then at the window. Meaning? Meaning he's either 20 feet tall or he climbed a tree to take the shot. John's voice pitched low, almost a growl. He stalked to the window and looked out. Meaning the guy crept onto the property, climbed a tree, fired that arrow, climbed back down and took off, and we still didn't catch him. The detective turned toward the window, catching sight of her on the way. You shouldn't be up here. This is my house. You're going to cut your feet. John snatched her slippers from the closet and held them out to her. Thanks. She dropped them on the floor and put them on. He was in a tree? Had to be, John said. How's your ex with a bow and arrow? The words had her backing up a step. Reed didn't do this. He wouldn't. John regarded her a long moment. Lake said he hasn't left the house all night, but he could have slipped by the bodyguards. It wasn't him. You're sure about that? John asked. Positive. Clearly displeased with her answer, he returned his attention to the detective, who was pointing outside and calling to someone on the ground. Denise watched as the uniformed officer snapped photos of the arrow, the glass, the gaping window, the room. He measured the angle and the distance to the window. She hadn't known about the trails, but even if she had, that wouldn't have stopped her from buying the property. When she'd chosen the house, she'd been thinking of its seclusion and its proximity to Ella. She hadn't been thinking of arrows and gunshots and murderers. Would any place be safe from those, though? Finally, the police officer pulled the arrow from the wall and set it on her bureau. He snapped another photograph of it. From where she stood at the room's entry, it looked thicker than any arrow she'd ever seen. Not that she'd seen any since the archery unit in elementary school gym class. "Look at this," the cop said. John and the detective moved closer, and she crowded in beside them. The cop pointed to what she'd thought was a thick white stripe on the black shaft. Looking closer, she saw it wasn't a stripe at all. Something had been affixed to it, held down and glossy with tape. John pulled out his utility knife. "Do you mind?" The detective said, "I'll do it. You're not wearing gloves." He took the knife and sliced the top and bottom of the tape. He moved his fingers gently along the width of it. Finding a seam, he slid the skinny knife along the spot, then picked at the edge. A piece of paper unfurled, and he straightened it out. She couldn't read it from her vantage point, but by the look on John's face as he huddled close, she wasn't going to like it. He shifted the paper so she could see. Words were written in all caps across the top in thick black ink. "Go home. You aren't loved here anymore." John's gaze met hers over the paper. "You're sure your ex? You said yourself he's at home." He grunted. "We think." "We'll check him out," the detective said. "Reed was at the park the day that man shot at me," Denise said. "I saw him there." John's lips pressed together as if he wanted to argue, but he said, "Right." "Okay." The detective gave the room one more visual sweep. "Let's go back downstairs." The cold air from outside had her shivering, but maybe not as much as the chilling words on that note. "You aren't loved here anymore." She could see why John suspected Reed. Whoever'd written that note had at some point loved her. An old friend? Her closest friends from high school were Reed, James, and Cassidy. As far as she knew, James had nothing against her. She and Cassidy had reconnected. Reed would never hurt her. None of them would do this. She couldn't think of a soul who would. Not anybody she knew, anyway. On the other hand, she was loved and hated by a whole lot of people who didn't know her at all. She led the way to the living room, sat on the sofa, and pulled the blanket over herself again. Detective Pollard asked her the same questions he'd asked the night before. Did anybody in town hold a grudge against her? Could she think of anyone who'd want her to go away? Besides Reed, maybe his parents? But none of them would resort to this. None of them hated her this much. While the cops and a few bodyguards talked, another guard jogged up the stairs, holding a blanket and a toolbox. A moment later, she heard pounding. "What in the world?" John must have seen confusion on her face. He turned away from the detective, lifting a hand to silence the man, and said, "They're covering your window, trying to keep out some of the chill." "Oh, I appreciate that." He turned back to Pollard. "We'll clean up the glass, unless that's a problem." "We got what we need. Go ahead." John spoke into his microphone, and a moment later, the vacuum cleaner purred overhead. They were cleaning? Seemed they were a full-service private security agency. The detective shifted his attention to her. "Ms. Masters, I'm sorry this happened. We'll do everything we can to find who did this and arrest him." "I'm sure you will. I'm grateful." "If you think of anything else." She promised to be in touch, but she couldn't imagine what she could tell him that he didn't already know. She was famous, and people hated her for reasons she couldn't comprehend. At least in Beverly Hills, she'd been one of thousands of famous people. Here in Coventry, she stood out. Apparently, somebody didn't like that.
Chapter 11. John sent Pollard to the guest house. He'd already directed a teammate to make a copy of all the video recorded that afternoon and evening, but Pollard wanted to see the setup himself. Between the police and the security team, eventually they'd figure out how the shooter had gotten so close. John wouldn't rest until they did. The guard whose job it was to monitor the cameras had missed something, obviously. The perimeter fence would be installed the following day, or, he glanced at the time, later that day, he supposed. Ms. Masters might not like the 8-foot-tall chain link, but she'd get over it. Not that it would have changed anything in this case. Ever since he'd heard the crash of glass breaking, he'd been working on adrenaline and fury. Now he imagined what had happened. Somebody had fired an arrow through the window, likely with a crossbow, a weapon powerful enough to launch an arrow a long distance. He wasn't a crossbow shooter himself, but he knew an expert could hit a target from 80, maybe 100 yards away, which meant the shooter might not have been on Miss Masters' property at all. Would they need to keep all the blinds closed in the house now? He hated to do that and figured his client would hate it even more. She should be able to feel secure in her own home. Finally, he shuffled everybody out. As much as he wanted to pore over the footage himself, his primary responsibility was keeping Ms. Masters safe. Somebody needed to remain in the house at all times, and she seemed to trust him. He'd stay connected via his earpiece, but for the time being, he wasn't leaving her alone. She'd snuggled up in the corner of her sofa, the blanket tucked around her, staring at the Christmas tree. Tears streamed down her cheeks. He'd seen this woman manage a lot already in their short acquaintance. She'd opened a package likely delivered by a serial killer. She'd been shot at and tackled and had feared she was being abducted. She'd been yelled at not once but twice by her jerk ex-husband. Despite all that, this was the first time he'd seen her cry. Instead of opening his mouth and saying something stupid, he went to the kitchen and turned on her electric kettle. She kept the house cool at night, and with the gaping window upstairs, the temperature probably hovered in the 60s now. He lowered the volume on the chatter in his ear. If his team discovered something he needed to know, they'd get his attention. He found a tea bag that seemed appropriate. What flavor was sleepy time? And dropped it in a mug of hot water, then stirred in honey like he'd seen her do the day before. With the cup and a box of tissues, he approached her cautiously. "I bet you don't get this much excitement in LA." She lifted her gaze, which showed him red-rimmed eyes and bone-deep sadness. Thank God Ella wasn't here. Not that the girl would have been in any danger. Ms. Masters hadn't been either. Not really. All the windows in the house had curtains or blinds, so it wasn't as if the shooter had aimed to kill. He just aimed to send his message. "She would have been so scared," Ms. Masters added. He set the mug and tissues on the coffee table. "To warm you up." "Thanks." She snatched a tissue and wiped her eyes, but the tears continued. "You're safe. I'm sorry that happened, and I know it seems scary. It was definitely intended to frighten you. Going to the safe room was just a precaution. I don't think he actually set foot on your property." "I don't care about that." He must have looked shocked because she added, "I mean, I do. Of course I do. But an arrow in my wall can't hurt me. A stupid note from some jerk can't hurt me. But Ella," she asked if she could spend the night. Her voice pitched high. "Thank God I said no, but only because I knew Reed would refuse. I didn't want to put him in that position." Why would she worry about that? But if I'd said yes, if Reed had said yes, your daughter would have been safe. She would have been terrified. First the breaking glass, then all the guards and cops. And it's not safe. Her voice rose and cracked on the last word. "It's not. A man shot an arrow through my window. He couldn't have been aiming. Someone shot at me the other day." At least she finally seemed to understand that the rifle shot hadn't been a random event. Until that moment, he hadn't thought she'd taken the threat to her life seriously enough. If nothing else, the arrow had driven that point home. He kept his voice low and confident. "We're going to protect you." "I'm not worried about me." She shot to her feet, dropping the blanket. She still wore his sweatshirt, and the sight of it, the way it fell to her thighs, hiding the short shorts she wore and highlighting those shapely legs. He lifted his gaze to her face and was very careful to keep it there, where fear and sadness reigned. "If I'm in danger, then I have to stay away from her. Don't you see? I came here to be with her. But if somebody's trying to kill me, then I obviously have to avoid her. I promised her, and..." She slumped onto the couch and ran a hand through her unruly hair. "I'm going to have to disappoint her. Again. Prove to Reed I'm a lousy mother. Again." He settled in the chair catty-corner to her. "What happened was not your fault." "Of course it's my fault. How many..." She seemed to falter for words. "Not famous people do you get hired to protect?" "They're not all famous, ma'am." She glowered at him, and he realized his mistake. "They're not all famous," he repeated, without the offending title. "Sometimes they are, but often they're people in powerful positions who've made enemies. People the average person wouldn't recognize." Miss Masters pulled the blanket over herself again. But fame, that's why I'm in danger. Because I'm an actor. Because people think they know me. They form opinions about me based on nothing. They love me or hate me based on nothing. He'd brought her the tea to calm her down, but her voice was rising with her irritation. Ms. Masters, I didn't mean to. Oh, for the love of all that's holy, stop calling me that. She swung her feet to the floor and straightened. It's Denise. Denise, I'm not your elder. I'm not your boss. I'm just a normal person. Do you call everybody you meet by their last name? In my work, yes. She blew out an exasperated breath. Well, I don't like it. I'm tired of being Ms. Masters and ma'am. I'm tired of being treated differently because of my job. I'm just an ordinary person who happens to be a halfway decent actor and got really, really lucky with a part, and now I'm... Masters isn't even my real last name. Did you know that? Uh, I just want to be Denise, Ella's mother, and now I can't even have that because of some nut job who doesn't want me in town for who knows what reason, and that nut job is going to steal my daughter away. You aren't loved here anymore, as if she had been at one time. If not Reed, then who? He'd wait to ask that question when she was in a less volatile mood. Instead, he said, we can keep both you and Ella safe. Right, I feel so safe. I can't even go into my bedroom. He cringed at the accusation but tried to hide his reaction. If he'd done his job well, it wouldn't have happened. This was his fault. She glared at him, then seemed to force a breath. She lifted the mug and sipped her tea and stared at the Christmas tree. You had quite a scare, he said. Maybe you should try to rest. I'm not as fragile as I look. I'll be fine. Who said anything about fragile? You seem pretty tough to me. She uttered a half laugh. Right. Nothing says tough like a pink tank top. The memory of the get-up she slept in had him swallowing. He shifted his gaze to the fire. You're not fragile. You're impressive. A beat passed before she spoke again. Why do you say that? You spent hours at the store today picking out ornaments for your daughter, one of which honored her father, who then attacked you. He didn't attack me. He was just angry. Whatever you want to call it, he faced her again. If someone had told me what was coming and asked me to predict your response, I'd have put money on your breaking down in tears. Do I seem that delicate to you? He took her question seriously, considering it. Not now that I know you. If not tears, I'd have guessed you'd get into a shouting match with him. But you didn't. Seemed to me that the angrier he got, the calmer you got. I was more concerned with how our fighting would affect Ella. Like I said, impressive. You put her needs before yours all day long. You were the one to pick out that ornament for her father, even though he's been treating you like he's the world's greatest jerk. She seemed surprised that he'd paid that much attention to the ornaments. You encouraged her to express her gratitude for her stepmother and step-grandparents, he added. I don't know what sent you away, but it's obvious you love your daughter. And that much love? He shrugged. Nobody can deny it forever, not even your idiot ex-husband. The faintest smile graced her lips. She lifted her mug. Do you want some? No, ma'am. She quirked one eyebrow. He cleared his throat. It's not appropriate for me to call you by your first name. You did earlier, to get your attention, but it'll be Ms. Masters from now on, and I'd appreciate it if you'd call me Donnelly. So I have to respect your wishes and call you by your last name, but you don't have to respect my wishes and call me by my first? How to argue with that logic? I mean, no disrespect. She just stared at him with those dark eyes. A man could get lost in those eyes. He forced his gaze away. Why do you care? Because you're here, witnessing all the ugliest things about me. What a terrible mother I am. You're not. I am. I'm trying to fix that. But my daughter couldn't think of one thing about me today, except that I'm in the movies and live in LA. What does that say about me? You get to witness how much my ex hates me. You get to see the absolute worst things in my life. For crying out loud, I have people who want to kill me on two coasts, and yet you and I can't be on a first-name basis? You get to stand in the corner and watch and judge, and I can't even call you by your first name? It's just, I feel... What? Because the only thing he wanted her to feel in his presence was safe. Did she not? How would calling her by her first name change that? And how had he gotten into this conversation? He'd worked in private security for years, and he'd never had any trouble keeping a professional distance. But it was the middle of the night, and Denise, Ms. Masters, was alone and vulnerable and feeling exposed. Ah. He tried to imagine what it would be like to have the worst things in his past exposed. It would be bad enough to feel that way, but to feel it with a total stranger, someone determined to keep his professional distance, maybe that made it worse. Maybe he could understand how she felt, to a degree anyway. I'm not judging you. Sure you are. You might not find me wanting, yet, but you're judging. How could you not? Let me rephrase. I am judging you, and I'm finding you sort of amazing. Her eyebrows hiked and her mouth opened the slightest bit. Oh man, he shouldn't have said that. How did professional distance and I find you amazing go together? But she was watching him with those mesmerizing eyes, those full lips parted in surprise, and he couldn't seem to get the shut up message to his brain. I expected you to be a prima donna, he said, demanding we wait on you, jump at your every command. Instead, you bought us pizza and apologized when you wanted to go shopping without giving us more notice. When your ex acts like a braying jackass, you make excuses for him. You keep your cool. You dote on your daughter. You're beautiful, kind, gentle, amazing. Not what I expected. What was wrong with him? He needed to sleep. He needed to get away from this gorgeous, vulnerable creature. She regarded him through squinted eyes as if trying to decide if he was being honest or blowing smoke. Granted, he'd been known to blow his share of smoke to soothe irritable clients, but that wasn't what this was. This was something completely different, something he'd never experienced with a client. This was a problem. He swallowed hard, cleared his throat. Anyway, it's obvious your daughter loves you, he said. Just keep doing what you're doing. How? When I can't even spend time with her. I won't put her in danger. I won't. He appreciated how worried she was about protecting her daughter. What bothered him was that she didn't seem as concerned about protecting herself. I promise you, we'll keep you both safe. We'll get your perimeter fence erected today, and I plan to install more cameras. You each have 3 guards at all times, 4 when you go out in public. That's more than... Maybe you could assign more to Ella and fewer to me. You're the one in danger. If it were up to him, they'd do just the opposite. But she's the one who matters. He pushed to his feet. I can't tell if you're serious or if you're being melodramatic. I'm not melodramatic. The vehemence in her words surprised him. Either way, knock it off. He didn't temper the anger in his voice. How could he protect somebody who had so little sense of self-preservation? Her eyebrows lifted high. He'd shocked her. Good. Are you a Christian? He asked. Or did you just go to church because Ella would be there? I'm a Christian. She practically spat the words. I don't get you people. He stalked across the room where he peeked out the window. All but one of the police cars was gone. The chatter in his ear had quieted. Guards were on duty, and aside from the broken window upstairs, things had gone back to normal. He turned back to face her. Your ex-husband is a hypocrite, and you clearly don't believe what you claim to believe. He's not a hypocrite. Her words were infuriatingly confident. Knowing what you should do and doing it are 2 different things. Being a Christian doesn't make you perfect. Obviously. And I know what I believe, she added. Is that so? Because you're acting like your worth is measured in whether or not people love you? Is that what the Bible says? Oh. She didn't add anything to that helpful comment. I'm not a Christian, he said, but I've been reading the Bible, and... Why? He took a few seconds before answering. Some of the anger had drained out of his voice when he did. I like to understand things. I like research. Huh. She tilted her head to the side and studied him. I know I don't seem the type. I didn't say that. She didn't have to. He knew what he looked like. Physically, he was his father's son. Dad was a cop, tall, broad, strong. But Mom was a high school history teacher who loved reading, research, and learning. He'd gotten that from her. When John had still been in the service, he'd studied the history and political systems of the nations where he was stationed and where he ran ops. In his life as a private security guard, he studied his clients' professions, and their enemies, which meant he'd studied the music scene, politics, various enterprises, and organized crime. And because of the job he'd done that summer, religion, he didn't explain all of that, though. All the stuff you hate yourself for. I don't hate myself. Whatever you want to call it, he said. Aren't you supposed to be forgiven? Well, yeah, I am, by God. In your religion, is your ex? Is anybody more important than God? Of course not. Then why do you act as if Coates or anyone's opinion of you is all that matters? It seems to me that if God loves and forgives you, then you're valuable because he says so. Right? She stared at him until he wanted to squirm. Are you sure you're not a Christian? She asked. Am I misunderstanding something? No, you're spot on. But you don't believe it, obviously. I do. She blinked a few times. Was that moisture in her eyes again? She'd finally stopped crying, and he'd started her up again. Great. I'm trying. She uttered a humorless laugh. It's not as easy as it looks. The way she stared at him with that tender, honest expression had his heart thumping wildly. I don't understand. If Christians don't believe the Bible, why should anybody else? Her lips parted, then spread into a smile. You know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. I do need to live as if I believe it. I've been working on that. Being back here just reminds me of everything I've done wrong. He let that sink in and thought maybe he understood. I guess being forgiven doesn't make you forget the past. If it did, he might become a believer himself. As if anybody would let me. John settled on the chair again. If Coate is half the man his daughter thinks he is, he won't be able to keep hating a woman who loves her so much. She tilted her head to one side as if really considering what he'd said. Don't judge him too harshly. I deserve his wrath. John scowled at that. I doubt it. That's because you don't know. John stood and stoked the fire. He should really encourage her to go to bed, but if she wanted to talk, he'd let her. Maybe she'd shed some light on who wanted her to leave town so badly, assuming she was right and it wasn't Coate. And maybe John was curious, more curious than he should be. When Ella was 4, Denise said, she was kidnapped. His gaze snapped to her, but she was staring at the mug on her lap. And I didn't come home. I couldn't. I wanted to, so badly. Tears filled her voice. It was torture, pure torture, but I couldn't come. He settled the fireplace screen in place. Why not? I was in the hospital because... She looked up, tried a smile that looked more like a grimace. It's a long story, but anyway, I deserve their contempt. Can you imagine? What kind of a mother doesn't come home in a situation like that? One who can't because she's in the hospital. Who could blame you for that? I only told Reed, but I don't think he believed me. Why? He shouldn't have used a demanding tone, but he was confused. He didn't understand, and he hated when he didn't understand. Because I wouldn't tell him what I was in the hospital for. She looked down again, shook her head. It's hard to explain. Something had her in a hospital that she was so ashamed or embarrassed about that she'd rather her daughter think she hadn't cared enough to come home. He couldn't imagine. She didn't seem inclined to explain, which was incredibly frustrating. She yawned and he glanced at the clock. 2:45. As tempted as he was to grill her until he got the answers he wanted and didn't deserve, he said, You should get some sleep. Are you going to stay in one of the rooms upstairs? Is it okay if I sleep right here? She swung her feet back onto the sofa. It's your house, He shut up before he spoke the dreaded word. I have an idea. Why don't I call you Denise and you call me John when we're alone? But when we're with other people, including my teammates, we'll be Ms. Masters and Donnelly. Would that work? A smile crossed her lips. If it's okay with you. He chuckled. Considering you've been calling me John all day, and you've glared at me every time I've called you anything but Denise, my feelings seem irrelevant. She dipped her head to one side. Is it that bad being on a first-name basis? Calling this woman by her first name was anything but bad, but he didn't say that. I'll get used to it. She seemed to have everything she needed, including a pillow, a blanket, and a flickering fire. Okay, Denise. He tripped over her name but recovered fast. Settle in. I'm going to be in the office, so... Oh, no. She started to sit up. If you plan to stay in the house, you can sleep here. I'll go upstairs. You stay where you are, the office is fine. I have men posted at both doors and 2 more patrolling the property. You'll be perfectly safe, okay? Do you need blankets? Help yourself to whatever you can find. I'll manage. Good night. He shut off all the lamps, leaving the room lit by the glow of the fireplace and the Christmas tree lights, and she stretched out on the sofa while he went upstairs to grab a pillow and blanket. Not that he'd sleep. He'd check in with the team, learn if they'd figured out how the shooter got so close without being seen. Somebody had sent that message. He needed to figure out who. It was after 5 a.m. by the time John closed his eyes. His teammates had discovered the shooter's nest in a tree near the trail, 75 yards from Denise's house. They'd finally found a camera angle that showed him army crawling through the woods on Sunday afternoon. Denise and Ella had been in North Conway at the Christmas store at the time. The man had climbed into a tree and then waited for 9 hours before firing his crossbow. 9 hours. The skill to get on the property without alerting guards, to make a shooter's nest in a maple tree, and to fire through the center of the window. All of that told John the enemy had military training. The patience to wait 9 hours, though. That was what terrified him most. If it was the same person who'd taken a shot at her from the boat, then John had no doubt he'd been trying to scare her at the park, not kill her. But what would he do when Denise didn't leave town like he demanded? Would he send another warning, or would he shoot to kill next time? Thanks to John's own military training, when it was time to rest, despite all the unanswered questions, he lay down and fell instantly asleep. A voice in his ear woke him up. The sun was bright outside. He glanced at his watch. 8:30. He tapped the mic. "What is it, Hughes?" "The X is here. I'll get back to you." He'd slept in his jeans, so he slipped on yesterday's t-shirt and headed for the living room. Denise was sitting on the sofa, a steaming mug in her hand. The sleeves of John's sweatshirt bunched around her wrists. The blinds were closed. Based on her relaxed expression, she had no idea Coat was outside. She smiled when he entered. "Did you get some rest?" "Enough. You?" She nodded. "There's coffee. Help yourself." "In a minute. Your ex is here." She slumped against the sofa. "Of course he is. We can send him away." Her expression brightened as if she considered it. "Does he know about last night?" "I assume so, yes." "How?" She pushed to her feet, then tugged his sweatshirt down. "It doesn't matter. I need 5 minutes." She hurried up the stairs, figured she wouldn't deny the man. Coat probably wasn't happy. Maybe John could help dispel some of that fury before Denise faced him. Not that protecting her from an angry ex was his job, but, well, he'd figure out his motivations later. Prepared for a confrontation, he yanked open the door and stepped onto the porch. The clouds that had hung low all weekend had blown away, leaving bright blue skies and colder temperatures. Coat stood on the walkway. It wasn't the man who caught John's attention, though. At his side stood a pretty redhead, wearing a tentative smile. Her jacket was open around her rounded belly. "Will she not see us?" Coat's words, carried in a puff of vapor, seemed calm enough, though John heard anger beneath them. John ignored him as he descended the 3 steps. He held his hand out to the redhead. "I'm Donnelly." "I remember you from this summer," she said, shaking. "Jackie Coat." "It's a pleasure, ma'am." Beside her, Coat surprised him by holding out his own hand. "We haven't met properly. I'm Reed." John gripped it. "You always stop by people's houses this early without calling first?" But Mrs. Coat answered, "It's my fault. I need to get to the lab, but I wanted to make sure Denise is all right." He stepped back and smiled at the woman. She seemed genuinely kind. Coat said, "It was a last-minute decision. We dropped Ella at school and then took the chance Denise would be awake. She had a long night. So she won't see us?" His words sounded cordial enough, but John didn't miss the tightness of the man's jaw. Apparently, he was on his best behavior for his wife. "Be patient. She'll see you when she's ready." Reed wrapped his arm around his wife. "Awfully chilly out here. You're welcome to wait in your car." "We're fine." Mrs. Coat pulled her jacket closed, though the fabric barely reached around her belly. "It's not that bad." John wrestled with saying more. It was none of his business, But Denise had had enough grief without this guy piling on. You heard what happened last night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Coates said. The barely controlled fury was back. Apparently, my ex thought I might be responsible. I'm the one who told the police to check your whereabouts. Coates' jaw dropped. Mrs. Coates' smile faded. Why? He turned his attention to the woman and tried to soften his expression. Your husband has made it clear that he doesn't want Ms. Masters here. He was the most likely suspect. It wasn't me. Coates sounded indignant. I would never. I heard you were cleared. John had gotten that bit of news before he'd gone to bed. Any idea who might have taken that shot? I'm guessing the guy's former military, maybe a sniper or a hunter, great with a crossbow, knows the mountain trails. Coates seemed to consider the question seriously. I can't think of anybody around here who'd threaten her. You're sure it was? I mean, Denise can be sort of melodramatic, so I thought maybe she jumped out her second-story window, ran through the woods, climbed a tree, fired a crossbow 80 yards into her own bedroom, climbed down from the tree, ran back, scaled her house, and was in her bed when I went in there to bring her to safety seconds later. Coates' mouth pressed closed, the corners turning downward. I get it! His wife was giving him a look he must have recognized because he seemed chagrined. To John, she said, she must have been terrified. She should have been terrified. She handled it. He'd said what he wanted to say. Now he was ready to be done with this conversation. He was turning to step back into the house, leaving the Coates outside, when the door opened. They looked past him. Mrs. Coates said, Sorry to intrude. No problem. Sorry for the wait, Denise said. Come on in. John led the way. The living room had been set to rights. The blanket and pillow Denise had used the night before stowed somewhere. She'd even stoked the fire. She wore a pair of jeans, a purple hooded sweatshirt, and tennis shoes. Her hair was swinging in a ponytail, which made her look years younger. More girl next door than movie star. Coffee? Tea? We're fine, Reed said. We heard what happened. Are you all right? She angled back, eyes wide, as if the question surprised her. It surprised John, that was for sure. I wasn't in any danger, though the sound of shattering glass will yank you awake fast. I bet. Reed nodded to the sofa. Can we sit? Please. The Coates settled on the sofa, Denise in the chair where John had sat the night before. He pressed his back against the wall where he could observe all their faces. Reed might not have fired that arrow, but that didn't make him safe. Do you have any idea who it was? Reed asked. None, she said. Do you? How would I know? You live here. Maybe somebody said something to you about me? He shook his head and turned to his wife. How about you? Nothing bad. She smiled at Denise. Cassidy only has kind things to say about you. I didn't tell her you were in town, and she wasn't at church yesterday, but I'm sure she'd love to hear from you and introduce you to little Hallie, the baby's darling. Denise gave Jackie a warm smile. I'll call her today. A little group of women from our church get together every Monday, Mrs. Coates added. Would you like to join us tonight? Oh, I was hoping. Her gaze shifted to Coates. I guess you probably don't want me anywhere near Ella after what happened. Her voice cracked, but she kept a brittle smile in place. I would love to be able to explain to her myself. The last thing I want is to let her down again. Coates glanced at his wife, who was giving him a look John couldn't decipher. Maybe you could come over after dance and explain. John cleared his throat and Coates glared at him. But Denise said, Go ahead, Jay Donnelly. When Ms. Masters is in the open, there's a chance she could be in danger. The man who shot that arrow is obviously well-trained. But inside, with blinds drawn, nobody will get close to her or your daughter. There's no reason that she shouldn't be able to spend time with Ella. I'm not going to put my daughter in danger to satisfy her whims. Denise seemed stunned, but it was Mrs. Coates who spoke. She's her mother, Reed. Love isn't a whim. Her voice was gentle but firm. Denise gave the woman a grateful look before speaking to John. You really think you could protect her? Both of you, absolutely. She's so little that all we have to do is surround her. Nobody could take a shot at her or get anywhere near her. He turned to Reed. I'm confident. And I'm supposed to trust you? John crossed his arms to keep from throttling the guy. Yes. Reed glared but said nothing. Okay. Denise's voice was calm, though he could see the hope in her expression as she faced him. So I could pick her up from school like I promised? Sure. No. Reed started to stand, but his wife seemed to hold him in place with a gentle hand on his arm. You really want me to break a promise to her, Reed? For no reason? You're in danger. Anything could happen when she's with you. Denise leaned forward and lowered her voice. And nothing bad's ever happened when she was with you. His mouth opened and closed. That's not fair. Perhaps, Denise said. But under your protection, Ella was kidnapped. Reed's face paled, his jaw tightened. She could have been kidnapped a second time in Boston. I would never. I know. Denise held up her hands to quiet him. I know what you did. I know you launched yourself over the seat and guarded her with your body. Her voice shook with the words. I know they would have had to kill you to get to her. John tried to imagine the scene. Coat didn't have John's width, but he was tall and broad enough. Amazing the things a person could do when someone they loved was in danger. I would not have let them take her. I know that. Here's what you need to know. Denise leaned toward him, propping her elbows on her knees. This might be hard for you to believe, and I haven't always shown it, but I love her that much too, Reed. I will do everything in my power to keep her safe, just like you did. Maybe I'm not as strong as you are, but I don't have to be because I have. She waved her hands toward John, and his heart did a little flip. He'd analyze that later. You can't promise Ella total protection at all times, Denise said, and neither can I. But I can promise you that I will take very seriously the need to keep her safe, including having Donnelly and the rest of his team involved. And if he tells me he can protect her, then I believe him. Reed pressed his lips together. John couldn't tell if he was considering her words or formulating a scathing reply. Before anything came out of his mouth, though, Denise continued, We'll be surrounded by bodyguards. The very last thing I want is to put her in danger. But whoever this guy is, he's after me, not her. If he were after Ella, which he isn't, being with me or not being with me would make no difference. If it will make you feel safer, I can keep my distance when we're moving from building to car and vice versa. She'll be surrounded by bodyguards, like Donnelly suggested. I'll make myself a target elsewhere. John barely suppressed a growl of frustration. This isn't an either-or proposition, Ms. Masters. We will keep you both safe. She aimed a smile his way, and he realized she was just trying to placate Coat. She trusted John with her safety. More than that, she trusted him with her daughters. Mrs. Coat angled to face her husband. Ella would be crushed if she couldn't spend time with her mother. You don't want that, do you? Based on the expression, he wasn't sure. He focused on Denise. When you're outdoors, you'll keep your distance from her. I can do that, Denise said. When you're indoors, you'll keep the blinds closed. Of course. School, dance, here, he added. No restaurants or shopping or anything else. John cleared his throat again, and again they turned in his direction. Just to be clear, we can protect them wherever they choose to go, as long as we're given enough lead time. For today, though, Denise hurried to add, we'll come back here. We'll deal with next time. Next time. She turned her attention to Mrs. Coat. We want to work on the gratitude wreath. Suddenly, Denise sounded unsure of herself. I hope that's okay. We got most of the supplies for it yesterday. Maybe I should have checked with you. But the woman's expression brightened. I would love that. Crafts are definitely not my thing. She turned to Reed. Unless you wanted to do it with her. John enjoyed watching the man wrestle with his answer. On the one hand, he didn't want Denise doing anything special with Ella. On the other, he probably didn't relish the idea of messing with ribbons and glitter and glue. It'll be nicer if you do it, he finally conceded. You always were good at that kind of thing. He glanced at his wife, eyes wide, but she just smiled at him. John liked Mrs. Coat about as much as he loathed her husband. Denise asked the details about dance class, typing them into her phone. I'll feed her dinner. What time do you want her home? 7, Reed said. I think 7:30 will work, his wife said. That gives her time to take a bath and get to bed by 8:30. When Coat didn't protest, Denise pushed to her feet. 7:30 it is. I'll drop her off. Maybe I should pick her up. Coat's remark had Denise's cheerful expression dimming. Okay. We'll deliver her safely at 7:30. John should have kept his mouth shut. He knew that. Maybe he should give Coat more credit. What did John know about being a father? But he did know about protection, and he knew how to keep the child safe. He knew no matter how much a person might want to, that it wasn't right to lock people away until all danger had passed. People had the right to live their lives. The duty, in fact, to not cower, but to boldly go on in the face of danger. Otherwise, the tyrants won. Looking at Denise, Coat said, "Fine, you can drop her off." He stood and helped his wife to her feet. "Congratulations, by the way," Denise said. The woman beamed, rubbing her belly. "We're so excited. He's due in February." "I'm happy for you." Ella seems thrilled. "She'll be a good big sister." John beat them to the door, tapping his mic. "Coming out. All clear?" "Clear," Hughes said. John pulled open the door. Coat was about to step out when he turned. His gaze flicked to John, but settled again on Denise. "I understand Donnelly thought maybe I was behind last night's event." "I never thought that," Denise said. "Not for one moment. You and I have had our differences, but I know you better than that." He ran a hand over his short hair, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Good. I'm not sure I deserve that, but thank you." She seemed at a loss for words as the couple walked out. John closed the door behind them. "You okay?" "Yeah, yeah." Surprising, no doubt. Maybe the world's greatest jerk wasn't as bad as John had first believed, or maybe he was just really good at pretending in front of his wife.
Chapter 12. Word traveled fast in Coventry. For all the gossip rags and the scandals whispered behind hands in Hollywood, nothing could beat the speed at which a rumor spread in a small town. Which explained how Cassidy had heard the news by 9 a.m. She called a few minutes after Reed and Jackie left, voice filled with a combination of concern and irritation. "Someone shot at you?" Denise snuggled beneath the comforter in her bedroom. The broken window meant the room was freezing, but she'd been about to shower when the phone rang. She explained to her friend exactly what had happened the night before, then added, "I should have let you know I was in town. I planned to come find you Saturday at the park, but..." She decided against telling her about the gunshot. "Things have been crazy. I heard you bought Aspen's old house up on Rattlesnake. It's a beautiful place. Garrett McCarthy, you remember him? He did a great job remodeling it." "I don't remember him from when we were kids, but I worked with him this summer. He built a guest house for me out back. He's definitely talented. But Aspen, should I know her?" "She's new to town. I'll introduce you. That is, how long are you staying?" "Through the holidays at least. And longer." But she'd fill Cassidy in on her plans later. "Yay! That's great!" Cassidy giggled into the phone, and the sound transported Denise back to high school, to a million sleepovers. She and Cassidy had done a lot of giggling and squealing and planning together. "Ella must be thrilled." Denise felt her own giggle trying to rise. "I think so. I'm spending the evening with her." "Oh, bummer. I mean, that's great. But I was going to invite you to girls' night. Do you remember Tabby Eaton? It's McCaffrey now. She was younger than us. Anyway, she hosts. Sometimes Chelsea O'Donnell, Hamilton, comes. You remember her?" "Everybody knows the Hamiltons." "Carly's from Boston. Grace is from Washington State, I think. Our newest member, Josie, moved here from D.C. She used to work in politics. She and Thomas Wyndham, remember him? Cute, winsome?" "Yeah, he's going to be the mayor come January. Anyway, he and Josie are together. Not engaged yet, but soon, I think. Of course you know Jackie. Would that be awkward?" "She invited me this morning, so I guess she wouldn't mind. She doesn't come very often anyway, what with her business and the pregnancy and Ella." Denise didn't know this grown-up Coventry world. Cassidy had told her about the girls' nights during one of their phone calls, but she hadn't mentioned the names of the women who went. Now Denise wanted to know them. She wanted to have friends here, believers to do life with like she had back in L.A. If she was going to build a life here, she'd need that. "Anyway," Cassidy said, "if you can't come tonight, how about lunch? I know James would love to see you." "Would he, really?" She couldn't help the skepticism in her voice. James was Reed's best friend, after all. He doesn't hold grudges like Reed. Nobody holds grudges like Reed. Cassidy didn't argue with that. So what do you say? Noon? Should she ask John first? No. John had said he could keep her safe anywhere, as long as he had enough notice. I can't wait. After she hung up, she hurried downstairs to tell John, but it was another guard standing in her living room. She couldn't remember his name. Humphrey? Hayes? Rather than ask, she told him her plans. He nodded. I'll let the boss know. After her shower, Denise was slipping into some of her warmest new clothes when John called up the stairs. Ms. Masters, there's somebody here to see you. It was stupid, but she was glad it was John, and not that other guard. Not that it mattered. It shouldn't, anyway. But she trusted John. She liked him. He made her feel safe. And so what if he was handsome and kind? She wasn't attracted to him. She pretended she didn't hear the voice in her head calling her a liar as she shoved her feet into her favorite leather booties, closed the bedroom door against the chill, and hurried to the top of the stairs. Who is it? One hand on the newel post, John looked up at her. Jack and Harper Rossi. They own the company that manages this house. Oh. She descended the staircase. Why are they here? John stepped back as she neared. I assume it's related to last night. Pollard said he was going to get a list of everybody who knew you were in town. Maybe they have some information for us. Why not just tell the detective? John's broad shoulders lifted and fell. I guess we'll have to ask him. Should I let them in? It was a lovely day, and she was dressed warmly. Let's talk outside. His brows lowered. Too exposed. She wasn't used to so much inside time. Back in California, she lived half her life outdoors, opening the oversized sliders that led from her great room to her deck and leaving them open nearly every day. She longed for fresh air and sunshine. But she didn't want to be difficult. Fine, let them in. John spoke into his earpiece, then opened the door. A moment later, a gorgeous blonde stepped into the room, followed by a tall, handsome brown-haired man. They both froze in the entry and gaped. She smiled and held out her hand. Hi, Denise Masters. The woman recovered first, shaking it. Harper Rossi, you're... Sorry, we didn't know. Denise had assumed they'd come because of who she was. But no, they gave this level of service to all their clients. She liked that. The man held out his hand to shake. Jack Rossi, we didn't realize who you were. Your paperwork is signed Denise Masterson. That's my real name. Masters is my stage name. Come on in. She led the way into the living room, which had been the scene of so many conversations in the last 12 hours. Have a seat. When they were all settled, Jack said, We heard you had some trouble last night. The police believe whoever broke your window could have found out you were here through my company. I came up here to speak with the detective and turn over our employment records. I've met everybody who works for me, but I'm less familiar with the ones in this neck of the woods. We're located in Nutfield. I've been there, Denise said. Cute town. So is Coventry. Harper glanced at her husband. We're thinking we need to bring the kids back in the summer. You'll like it. Lots of activities for children. Anyway, Jack shifted in his chair. I wanted to apologize. If anybody in our company passed information about you along to anyone else or... He shook his head, glanced at his wife. God forbid, if one of my employees shot that arrow, I'll work with the authorities to have that person prosecuted. I'll take full financial responsibility. That's very kind of you. The least we can do. Well, that and... I have a crew prepared to repair your window. If you'd prefer to hire your own people, I completely understand. Just send me the bill. But with the labor shortage, I thought it might be easier if we took care of it for you. Denise glanced at John, who spoke to Jack. You know these people? They're trusted employees from Nutfield. They have nothing to do with the contracts this far north. You can trust them. John nodded to Denise. I would really appreciate that, she said. The man pushed to his feet. Is it okay if I get measurements? She waved him toward the staircase. Just walk toward the Arctic. 10 minutes later, Jack and Harper left after promising to send their crew back that afternoon. As soon as they were gone, Denise turned to John. "Lunch is okay?" "You don't need my permission." Amusement flicked the corner of his lips, and her heart swooped as if she were riding a roller coaster. What was wrong with her? Was she so starved for attention that she'd fall for the first guy who listened to her? John was being paid to listen to her. Who cared if he was handsome in that rugged American sniper sort of way, tall and broad and gorgeous? He wasn't a romantic possibility. He was an employee. "I've got some work to do," he said. "We'll load up at 1:15." He marched down the hall toward her office. She watched his broad back until he disappeared through the door. She needed to get a grip. It was bad enough being so far from the church friends who'd become her family in California. But with Reed's anger and the death threats, not to mention the serial killer out there somewhere, she was feeling vulnerable. And when she felt like this, she was vulnerable to anybody or anything that could make her feel like she mattered, like she was worthy. She moved into the kitchen and settled at one of the bar stools, closing her eyes. "Father, I'm worthy because you say I'm worthy. I don't need Reed or Ella or anybody else to love me to know I'm loved. Your love is enough. I don't need alcohol or drugs to fill me. You fill all my empty places. I don't need the adoration of fans to know I matter. You say I matter. I am yours. Help me remember, Lord. Despite everything, help me hang on to you." She breathed in the truth in her prayer, breathed out all the insecurity that had no place in the heart of a believer. John was right about that. If she didn't believe what the Bible said, why should anybody else? Settled in the back seat of the SUV, Denise scrolled through her phone. Bystanders had taken videos of her argument with Reed at the Christmas store the night before and posted them on social media. She watched a few, scanned the comments. As usual, people who hated her excoriated her, and people who loved her defended her. There seemed plenty on both sides of the argument. Neither the praises nor the criticisms were true. Neither mattered in the grand scheme of things, and she ought not to waste a single moment reading their comments. With that thought in mind, she closed the app. There'd been a time when she'd lived for the praise of the public. When she was loved, she was on cloud 9. When she was hated, she sank into depression. She didn't have to live like that anymore. Now she was God's, and his opinion of her mattered more than anybody else's. John had reminded her of that fact. A man who wasn't even a believer had picked up on her faithlessness. "Lord, use his curiosity to bring him to you. Speak to him as he reads your word." "Ma'am?" John reverted to the respectful title for the sake of the guard driving. "Yes, Donley." She smiled as she played along. "Since your ex has been cleared, I wondered if you have any other former boyfriends around." "Reed was my high school sweetheart. There weren't any other boyfriends in New Hampshire." "Other guys who took an interest in you? Maybe somebody you rejected? Maybe someone younger or older?" Closing her eyes, she considered the question. Truth was, most people wouldn't recognize the Denise of elementary and middle school. She'd been an awkward kid, all arms and legs. Gangly and insecure, tomboyish, not girly. She'd had friends, of course, but none as good as Cassidy, who had moved to Coventry in high school, and Reed and James, who'd been her friends since kindergarten. She opened her eyes to see him watching her. "I don't think so." "How about older guys, men with an unhealthy attraction to you? Teachers, coaches?" "Gross! Not that I know of." "How do you know it wasn't a woman?" The person on the surveillance video looked like a man. Could have been a tall woman, but most shooting crimes involve men. Why, can you think of a woman who might have done this? "No." He blew out a long breath. "Somebody wants you to leave town. Try to think." "I am thinking," she snapped. Try to, as if it were an effort, as if smoke might come out of her ears with too much brain work. John said nothing. The other guard said, "Maybe fathers of friends, people you babysat for?" "I had a very normal childhood. I was just an ordinary girl, and this is an ordinary town. That sort of thing doesn't happen in Coventry." The guards shared a look. John said, "All due respect, that sort of thing happens everywhere." "Well, not to me." John faced forward until they reached the intersection with the road that led to town. Then he turned toward her again. We're just trying to jog your memory. We don't mean to offend. Of course, she was being too sensitive. Melodramatic, Reed would say. She hated that word. She plastered on her all is well, and I'm as happy as can be smile. No problem. Her acting skills could be useful in all sorts of situations. Though by the way he squinted, he wasn't buying it. Would you mind if I asked your friend some questions? Maybe she heard something or remembers something you've forgotten. After we eat, I guess. When the guard double-parked in front of the Patriot, John said, "Wait there," and stepped out. Traffic bunched up behind them. More than one person glared as they inched by, though, because of the tinted windows, they couldn't possibly see her. The other SUV had parked just ahead, and one guard walked inside. A moment later, through the car door, she heard John say, "Coming in," and then her door opened. Sheesh. How to make a scene. When she stepped onto the asphalt, she was immediately surrounded by a ring of tall, broad-shouldered men. Directly in front of her, John led the way inside, through the restaurant, and toward the back. Finally, he stepped to the side. Cassidy was standing beside a booth. The moment she saw Denise, her arms opened. Denise stepped into them and hugged her old friend. "It's so good to see you. Sorry about the fuss." She waved toward the 4 guards as they retreated to various areas in the restaurant. Unlike in LA, where bodyguards wore dark suits, these dressed in everyday clothes: jeans, sweaters, windbreakers. If not for the strange way they'd entered, nobody would peg them for guards. Oh, maybe that was the point. Denise said, "You look fabulous." Cassidy was beautiful, with her dark brown hair and those enviable blue-green eyes. She'd always been the prettier one, and now she looked radiantly happy. On the table, a beautiful little girl with eyes that matched her mother's beamed up from a bouncy seat. "Oh, my word, she's gorgeous." "Right?" Cassidy slipped into the booth, and Denise sat across from her and grabbed the baby's socked foot. "Aren't you precious? I'm your Aunt Denise." The baby giggled. To Cassidy, Denise said, "I'm in love." 2 seconds, and I'm a goner. Cassidy beamed at her baby. "Me too." Denise saw James approaching and said, "You're lucky she looks like you, and not that troll of a husband." "Hey now," James said, mock scowl on his face. "It's true, but you don't have to say it." Denise stood again, and James gave her a quick hug, then set her away to look at her. "I'm glad you're home." Clean-cut, athletic, James had grown his hair long and scruffy after his sister died and Cassidy disappeared. Without the grief that had been etched on his face for years, with his long hair pulled back in a ponytail, he looked good. Not just good, but, like his wife, happy. "I'm glad to be here, truly." "How long are you staying?" he asked. "A month or so, maybe longer." "That's wonderful." "I don't think Reed agrees." James's smile faded a little. "He'll be okay. He can handle a little competition for Ella's attention, even if he doesn't want to." "There's no real competition, James. She adores her daddy." He squeezed her elbow. "She adores her mommy, too." He stepped back to include Cassidy. "I just came over to say hi. Hopefully we can catch up more later." He shot his wife a broad smile, waved at Hallie, who giggled and kicked her chubby legs, and walked toward the kitchen. Denise sat again. "I haven't seen him that happy since high school." Amazing what God can do, isn't it? They caught up over clam chowder and fried haddock and French fries. The food was good, if a little greasier than she was used to. But the conversation was the best she'd had in a long, long time. There were a lot of hard things about being in Coventry, but reconnecting with Cassidy wasn't one of them. Despite the years that stretched between them, their friendship felt as strong as it had been before Cassidy disappeared when she was 18. The dishes had been cleared, their drinks drained, refilled and drained again, when John caught Denise's eye from his post against the wall. She saw the silent question in his gaze. She didn't want this to end, but Cassidy had things to do, and Denise needed to get the supplies for the wreath. "Do you mind if my bodyguard asks you some questions?" Her friend looked surprised, but said, "Sure, no problem." Denise waved him over, and he approached and shook her hand. "Donley." Cassidy Sullivan, join us. Denise slid to the end of the booth, and John sat beside her. We're trying to think of anybody who might have something against Denise. She couldn't think of anyone, but I thought maybe, since you live here, you might have heard of someone with a grudge against her. Maybe someone who used to like her but now doesn't. Someone with hurt feelings? Cassidy was shaking her head. I'm sorry, I can't think of anybody. I left a long time ago, though. I've only been back a few years. From school? Old boyfriends? Maybe guys who had crushes she never knew about? No, sorry. He asked her all the same questions he'd asked Denise in the car, and Cassidy had no more insights. You should talk to James, Cassidy finally said. He owns this place, and he's been in Coventry all his life. James is my husband. She pointed behind the lunch counter. He hears everything that goes on in Coventry. Hold on. She shuffled out of the booth and headed James's way. When she was gone, John said, She's nice, your friend. The best. He smiled at the baby, who was watching the scene with wide eyes. What a cutie! Denise had left when Ella was only 4 months old, so she'd missed this stage with her. For the 1000th time, she asked herself how she could have done such a thing. No matter the depression, no matter the terrible, terrible thing that had happened to her, she should have stayed. She should have stayed and dealt with it. Learned to be a mother. People assumed that, considering the level of success she'd enjoyed, she probably had no regrets. They were wrong. Denise's adult life consisted of one long stream of regrets. Cassidy and James returned, and John stood. After the men introduced themselves, they all sat again, and John began round 3 of the same tiresome questions. As expected, James didn't know of anybody who'd had a crush on Denise in high school. Besides Reed, of course. He was head over heels back then. James rolled his eyes, as if he found it amusing. John was all business, though. How about in the last few years? John asked. Anybody give you the impression they disliked her or liked her too much? Anybody overly interested? James sat up straighter. Actually, there was a kid a few years ago. Forget his name. He was with his dad and a group of guys on a backpacking tour I led. John leaned in. Tell me about him. Teenager? 17 or 18? He mentioned Denise multiple times in the first couple of hours of our hike. Her movies, mostly, but it was obvious he was a fan, so I told him, bragging a little. He shot Denise a wink. That I'd been friends with her in high school. That was a mistake. He didn't stop peppering me with questions for the rest of the trip. James smiled at Denise. The 3-day trip. Torture, Denise said. You have no idea, James deadpanned. But John wasn't amused. Any idea why he was so enamored with her? To Denise, James said, he claimed he changed a tire for you once. It seemed unlikely because you didn't come home a lot back then, but maybe I just didn't know you were here. She remembered. I came to visit my parents. I was going to see if Reed would let me see Ella, but then her parents had been so unkind. What kind of mother leaves her child? What kind of mother chooses money and fame over family? What kind of mother? The words had become Mom's mantra. Her father never joined in, but his disapproval was obvious enough that he didn't need to add words. She'd come home desperate for help with her addiction and desperate to see Ella. But they'd started in the instant she'd walked through the door. Ultimately, instead of asking for help, she'd popped a few pills, downed a few shots, and in that inebriated state, decided to go for a drive. After years of counseling, she could admit now that she might have had a death wish. She hadn't actually thought it through, but there'd been that tiny voice in the back of her mind. Nobody would miss you. She'd just turned toward the road that wound up Mount Ayasha, headed for a place where the trees were sparse between the road and a steep drop-off, when the tire on her rental blew out. That instant terror, the feeling like she was no longer in control of the car, had sobered her up. She'd had no reception on her cell and had no idea what she would have done if that kid hadn't happened by. He'd changed her tire, then offered to follow her home to be sure the skinny spare held up, and maybe because he'd figured out she wasn't entirely sober. She'd decided then that she had to quit the drugs and drinking before she killed herself. She'd decided that many times before she actually did it. The silence might have stretched and become awkward, but John filled it, his focus on James again. You know the kid's name? I can go through old records, James said. It'll probably take me a couple of days. John stood, pulled a business card from his jeans pocket, and handed it to him. Call me when you get the name, or if you think of anything else. James pushed out of the booth and took the card. Will do. Both men seemed to think they'd come across an important clue, but surely that skinny teenager hadn't shot at her. He'd liked her, right? Could that morph into hate so easily?